Thanks for tuning in to another Fire Conversation. Today we have a special guest, Guy Morris, and he's going to give us a lot of insight into some of the things that he's been looking into when it comes to AI, and also how that relates to biblical prophecy and just our lives in general and our walk with Jesus. Thank you, Guy, for joining us. I know that you have a lot going on, so thank you for fitting us into your schedule.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So because there's so many different things that we want to talk about, but we really want to have a discussion about how you, as an AI expert, combine your insights of viewing AI through a more critical lens than probably most people do,
Right.
and how it ties into a biblical perspective. You know about a lot of the technical, ethical, societal, and spiritual aspects of it. But before we really get into those things, I just want you to just take a moment to explain to everyone a little bit about who you are and what your thoughts are about how your personal walk with the Lord, how did that begin? How did you, come to know the Lord? And then how did that lead you to where you are today with some of these things that you're looking into?
How many hours do you have?
Uh,
I'll do my best. I'll do my best to give you the Cliff Notes version.
okay.
Let's start with my walk with the Lord. How I kind of got to the place where I was able to think in terms of artificial intelligence and complex systems models, because wasn't at all where apparent that I was going to end up there. I tell everyone that my real life started at age 13 as a homeless runaway on the streets of LA, working alongside migrant workers. I don't talk about the years before that because I need a therapist to do that. It took until my 50s, however, before somebody was smart enough to put the dots together and diagnose me with complex PTSD. So I have struggled with PTSD my entire life. But it started off as a homeless runaway. And so I learned early on in my head that I could never rely on anybody, that the only person I could truly rely on was myself if I wanted to eat and survive. Now, it was during that time I went home briefly, um, um, after one of the major threats at home had left, and to get a GED. And while I was trying to get a GED during that time frame, I lived in Southern California, and I was in Chino at the time. For those who don't know, it was a largely Hispanic population. There was a state prison not too far from there, just kind of one of the neighborhoods people didn't want to end up in, mostly rural. But a small, I worked alongside immigrants, so I have a deeper respect for my Hispanic friends. But a small gang came up and tried to harass me and intimidate me. Well, I had been on the streets for a few years, so that was not. I'm very small, but I'm sort of like what do they call them? Uh, the yeah, I'm fierce. Anyway, we wound up all getting into a fight. I wound up making a couple noses bloody that got all over my clothes. And even though I was the one being picked on and harassed and bullied, it wasn't the first time. And so I was suspended from school. While I was on the way home from school, a guy that everyone knew as the Jesus freak, the long haired kind of hippie guy, saw me going home in the middle of the day, crossed the street, came up behind me. Again, not a good thing to do if you're a street kid. And so I turned around, he started getting close. I turned around, I grabbed him by the collar, and I went to punch him, and he laid his hand on my shoulder and started praying in tongues.
Wow. Mm.
And I was just like, okay, I didn't see that one coming. Um, and I can only say that I didn't understand it in my head. I had never been to now, I had been to church a little bit because my mother had married an ethnic Italian in Newark, whose family was in the mob, but we weren't we were the, heathen, um she was the heathen with the bastard children unless we could get confirmed as Catholics. So I went to church long enough to get confirmed as Catholics, and even then, bullies would pick on me, and I was tough neighborhoods, and I would get in fights, and we'd get kicked out. So church was not really something that I was really familiar with at all, and certainly nothing having to do with the real gospel. And so I really didn't have an understanding of what he was doing or what he was saying, but all I know is that the Spirit of the Lord fell on me. And I did something I hadn't done in years. I sat in a dirty gutter and started to bawl. Hmm. Needless to say, I went home. I told my mom that I had accepted the Lord. She slapped me as hard as she could and told me she wasn't going to put up with any of that BS. I was in deep trouble this time.
Wow.
And that began my walk in the Lord.
Wow.
Now, less than a year later, I had felt that I was called to leave home for good. I had got my GED. I was 15 years old. I packed a little small backpack and taped up a little tiny guitar I bought in Tijuana in a cardboard box. And I walked a couple miles to the local freeway and I hitchhiked to Tucson, Arizona, where I joined a commune for 3 months. And that's where I started understanding and fellowshipping with people who had a deeper roots in the word. I didn't stay at the commune because of my PTSD. I had trouble dealing with people in close intimacy, and I was just a constant nervous wreck. But I continued to go to church, and that's where I kind of laid down my roots. And by the time I was 19, and so that kind of where I started the Lord. By the time I was 19, though, I had married too early. My wife got pregnant right away. And I was driving produce trucks 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, making not much money at all and not enough to support a family. And I went to prayer one day and I said, Lord, I want to know if I can send my wife back to work, not forever, just long enough so that because I couldn't even have time to go look for a job if you're working, from 5 in the morning till, 7 at night. You claim and apply for a new job, right?
Mhm.
Because nobody's open on Sunday to take an application or talk to anybody. So I thought, well, if I can get her to go back to work for even a month, that'll give me time to go out and at least look for a job that's not going to kill me and destroy my family because I never had any time for my family. Well, it sounds strange. It would have sounded strange to me at the time. It sounds strange even to me saying it, 50 years later. But I felt another compulsion from the Lord. I want you to go to school. I want you to go to college. It's like me. I didn't even barely. Okay, Lord. You must mean the guy down the other end of the block. He's the one that finished school. He's the one that took SATs. He's the one that's the smart kid. I was told I was dumb my entire life. Don't bother. And I was thinking, okay, that was weird. So I went back to prayer again, and I felt even stronger. Get up right now. I want you to call the university, ask for an application. You're going to go to school. So I did so, and when I told my wife, her first response was, "Oh, that's so sweet of you for trying." So I didn't tell any of my friends. I got an application in the mail. I had no idea what I had to declare a major. I had to get my first wife's help to complete the essay because I was functionally illiterate. When it came time to declaring a major, she said, "What are you gonna major?" I said, "I don't know. The Lord didn't tell me that." I did this one of the blind-eyed, poking down, and I ended up declaring myself as an electrical engineer, one of the hardest majors you can possibly pick. And here's the kid with no SAT scores and barely finished high school. And I thought, okay, well, this is a joke. There's no way that this is it. This is just the Lord seeing if I'll humiliate myself enough to do it. Well, and on top of that, it's like the beginning of August. School starts at the begin in 3 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks in the beginning of September. That late in the year, there's no way they got room. And I had to call home and try and see if I could get SAT scores. I did, which I never took, but I got my transcripts. And in my transcripts, I realized I had already gone. It took me 16 schools to get from the first grade to the 10th grade.
Wow.
And the chaos that kind of brought my life. Well, lo and behold, and I'm taking this story's taking way longer than it should. I'll sum it
No,
up.
no, no. Go ahead. Go ahead.
The Lord,
I do have one question. When you're after this about something you said earlier about
yeah,
the
the
comp.
Lord got me into school. The Lord got me accepted, and beyond all belief, but I still had no money. And so I threw the letter away. I said, "Well, this is no good. I still don't have any money to go. I'm still have to solve the problem of how do I pay the bills when I can't? How do I pay tuition and books when I can't even pay the bills?"
Yeah.
The very next day, my wife's father, he was a wealthy man, and I didn't know that when I married her. He wrote me a letter and said, I think you've had a crappy shot at life. I think you have potential, but you're going to have to work hard to make use of it. I'm not going to pay your livelihood. You have to still go to work, but if you're willing to go to school at night, or if you're willing to go to school, I'm willing to pay your tuition and books."
Wow.
Mm.
Wow.
So guess who went to school? First few years, I was working my fanny off and flunking because I didn't have the skills. Something clicked. I don't know what. I was about ready to quit because it wasn't working. I wound up graduating with multiple degrees. I got a full scholarship to go to grad school. I was on the dean's list. I was accepted into Harvard MBA program because somewhere along the way, something had clicked in my head and it started working. And I was able to develop, I got all that attention because I had developed a macroeconomic model that had outperformed the Federal Reserve and changed how we build economic models to this very day. And growing up my entire life being told that I was stupid, to realize I had just done something that some of the smartest minds in the nation had not done.
Yeah, you know, it's amazing how sometimes it seems like the enemy tries to stop us from where, you know, he knows God is taking us, right? So there's people in our lives, people that say, you can't do this, or you're not smart enough, you're not capable enough, or, you know, people that try to sow those seeds of doubt early on.
Those weeds are hard to get rid of. It took me
Yeah.
decades
Right.
of still going through working with CXOs of major corporations, still feeling like I was a poser, I was stupid, and people were going to figure it out soon.
Mm.
It took that long to get over that. That was always driving me, that I needed to work twice as hard as anybody else to make sure I could prove myself.
Wow.
So that began both my Christian walk and my career.
So there's something that you mentioned, and this this stood out to me. And you talked about at one point being in a commune, right?
Mhm.
And so one of my favorite books of the Bible is the Book of Acts, and you know, the first time I read the Book of Acts, that really opened my eyes to let me know that, you know what, the church is not always, at least from my church experience, not really doing what I'm reading here, right? And I'm seeing how it says, you know, everyone had everything in common. People were, you know, living together, eating together, all that. So when I think of communes, right, I think that that's kind of the idea. But in a perfect world, it seems like that would work all the time, right? But you mentioned that even though it might be, you know, beneficial in some ways, right, it does come with its own challenges. So
Mhm.
what do you think about that? Do you think that that's even realistic in the 21st century?
Yeah, I think for certain types of people, I think it's an amazing experience to be able to be in fellowship, to have accountability, especially when you're young and you're still trying to figure it out. Union Gospel Mission is a shelter here in Seattle that deals with people coming off the streets, coming off of drugs, learning how to rebuild their life. They live in community together for a few years. They go through a program where they can graduate. It really can be amazing in helping to rebuild a life when you've had shattered expectations, shattered family values, shattered trust. You know, sometimes you can't just go from those kinds of that kind of existence to a stable, healthy one without seeing some examples and having a few people guide you in and having a few rough edges that you got to work off of with others in order to kind of get there. And so as I said, I had complex PTSD, so I've had hyper anxiety my entire life living with, and I had been, my whole life was being the new kid. And so there was always a part of me that I had difficulty opening up to others and feeling like I could be, and when you're in a small commune, there's a lot of intimacy and I wasn't used to it and I didn't know how to handle it and I didn't feel safe with it yet because it had just started happening to me. And so it took a long time. Now I continued to stay at the church and there's a lot of really great grounded teachers at the church. One of my favorite a pastor who taught me, this was a church that really taught the true values of what the early church was teaching and wasn't concerned about how big the church was or how big the auditorium was and I even got an example of a pastor and one of the things they had different was they had 7 different pastors. They had a pastor staff of 7, each of them being a qualified pastor from different one of them was Lutheran, one of them was, you know, uh, uh, um the one of the really Pentecostal, churches, one of them was Baptist, and they all had and one of them grew up as a missionary in Mexico, and they kept each other accountable, and there was even a time when what impressed me the most was a time when the lead pastor basically had got up at church and confessed that he'd been somebody had come to him and really kind of, convicted him of some of his sins, that he really needed to step down from being a pastor for a while so that he could really deal and clean up his own heart. He wasn't had to go anywhere. He'd be in the church just like everybody else. And for a few months, the other pastors just took over his duties, and he sat in the congregation with the rest of us, just getting his heart right. And that really taught me something about being honest with ourselves and being honest with God about what's going on in our life and not trying to pretend for the sake of show.
Right.
And he humbled himself in front of others, which gave the rest of us the courage to humble ourselves. And that was a real good, and because I've never seen another pastor since. I've seen pastors who were found to have cheated on their wives with a girl and the woman in the congregation, left their wife and 4 children to go with this girl and still expected to be the pastor. I've had pastors who, um, uh, really couldn't identify their what the Bible teaches versus what their politics were. And so for me to have a pastor who could get it right was a really good example for me early on. And so it taught me because I would eventually, throughout my career was starting to rocket, but I still had troubles dealing with addiction and depression and hyperanxiety and frequent nightmares and social issues. I could be brilliant in front of a boardroom or in front of a bunch of tech guys, but you put me at a party where I just had to talk about something simple and I basically wither, like a snowball, you know? And it took me years to understand how to break out of those molds, and I went to therapists, they didn't know how to help because nobody understood PTSD back then. I went to church and they didn't know how to help because I couldn't really tell them what I was going through, nobody understood. I actually had one Christian therapist try to cast a demon out of me, and so it was a lot of misdiagnosis, which kept me hiding everything in secret for a long time. Now let's go to where the AI piece comes in. Now, during this time, there's 2 pieces of this story that really come together. One is trying to develop a different, better understanding of prophecy, and I wanna come back to that one in a minute, because that was really different because one of the things I experienced as my analytical brain started to develop, I would listen to pastors and I would have to say, "No, wait a minute, sounds good, but that's not what I'm reading in the Bible."
Mm.
I'm disagree I think you're taking out of context, or I think you've got a bias in how you're interpreting that, especially when it comes to prophecy. Now, in my career piece, I started to continue to develop. I spent 40 years in Fortune 500 companies, often working for CXOs and senior levels and VPs if I wasn't running my own group or building my own company or doing something like that. But I continued to work on different elements of technology. I was always an innovator, and so I was always looking at how do I use the latest version of technology to make my business better, more productive. And so I worked on a lot of various forms of technologies over the years, including as a consultant, as a project manager for major multi-million-dollar deals, and then at Microsoft as their program manager, overseeing dozens of different major projects. I had a portfolio at one point of $750 million. And so I've been used to the idea of how do we, what does technology look like from the lab to where it's operational. And one of the things I implemented early on in one of those phases was an early version of what we now call artificial intelligence. We called it expert systems back then. So it got me, I was in touch with what the technology could do then, what the weaknesses were, how those weaknesses were being developed. And so it was one of the things I tracked over the years. But the key event that hooked me, that obsessed me with getting more involved with understanding how it was being used outside of what I was doing in my own business, came when I discovered a small, obscure Associated Press article in a small military technology magazine that because I had customers that were military, I would read some of the stuff. The article only said very, very short, 3 sentences maybe. A program had escaped the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories at Sandia. If I knew anything, I should contact some FBI agent or some professor. That was it. Now, the geek in me could have passed right over. Most people would have passed right over that. I couldn't. I cut it out. I taped it onto my monitor. I said, it's either a typo. It didn't say the program was stolen. Didn't say the program was corrupted. Didn't say the program was lost. Didn't say the program malfunctioned. It said a program had escaped. Now, that particular laboratory is a NSA spy lab. It's the same laboratory that created the Stuxnet virus that wandered the internet for years until it found an Iranian centrifuge site, and then it went crazy and destroyed the whole site. So this is a sophisticated piece of spy software that got away from the laboratory, and then they couldn't find it. And so I got obsessed. I spent a year working in my own head. What are some of the architectural components it would need to have in order to do that? How would I design a piece of software to do that? And if I did have that really cool stealth technology where they couldn't find it, what would I design? What did I want that program to do to begin with that needed that stealth technology? Now, at this point, it's just me being a geek and a nerd and obsessing over something I thought was cool. But a friend of mine at the time, I lived in LA, and a close friend of mine was a indie film producer. And so we talked about, hey, I got this really cool idea for a spy movie, right? And so we talked about it, went back and forth, and we decided to create a webisode series out of it because it was cheap and we got the idea out. And this was an internet-based program, so we thought it might be a way of just getting attention to the whole project. So we did. We wrote scripts, we created sets, I did digital sets, we created a whole website, I hired out-of-work actors, we shot film, we put this together, won a bunch of awards, and it featured this program that was missing. And one of the studios optioned the deal. And 2 weeks before the studio option was supposed to get signed, 2 FBI agents showed up at my door.
Wow.
Yeah, that's all.
First, I thought it was a joke. I thought it was my friend Jack. I said that he hired a couple more out-of-work actors just to train. I said, okay, this is a joke. I was like laughing at him. I thought this is hilarious. Did Jack send Jack? How much did Jack have to pay it? Hey, let me see those badges again. Oh, they're real. Okay, I guess you. So it didn't start off well. So they were apparently very upset and concerned that I had figured out about their top secret missing program. Very upset. What they did not expect was my giddy, snarky attitude. Yes, 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 I did it, I did it, I did it, I did it. You wouldn't be here if I was wrong. I'm gonna tell all of my friends, this is so cool. I'm so excited. They, I've never seen two FBI agents turn pale white, look at each other like, what do we do now? So they gave me the "We're not a news" speech. I gave them the whatever shrug, and then my wife came home and gave me the "Honey, why are there two FBI agents in my dining room? This better be a damn good story, buddy." So that was that incident. Now I still had to go to my career, had to go work I had a startup next, and then Oracle, and then Microsoft, and worked on, with big data and all kinds of other technologies that were continuing to develop the AI technologies. It changed about 2012 with some things that most people who weren't in the industry would have never seen. So by 2018, when I retired, I wanted to write books. This was one of the stories I wanted to focus on. And I knew at that point where the technology was in the lab roughly. And so I know that the trajectory between how long it takes to get from the lab to the commercial space, and how the government is roughly about 10 years ahead of this commercial sector. And so I just brought that missing program technology forward to the current time, and I produced Swarm in 2020, and so it predicted all of the things that people were shocked with ChatGPT in 2022. I had already been writing about years before.
Wow.
So, because I can, it's not just what the industry can do now, it's what the trajectory of lab developments are for the next step. Now, people don't understand that AI has been technology. The first conference on AI was in 1956.
Wow.
And so there've been several internal industry investment phases and failures of really getting this technology where we need it to be. But we're roughly about where we said we would be. In 1956, we said that within a generation, we'd have certain things done, and we're roughly on track of that. And we've actually started leaping ahead of that curve. The ability for a computer to have a conversation with somebody where if you didn't know you were talking to a computer, you wouldn't know, um, is something called the Turing test. Now, Alan Turing was a genius that in World War II created the first fundamental computer that he used to decode the German Enigma code that allowed us to win World War II. Very, very famous genius. But Turing said that when computers can be so intelligent that they can carry on a human conversation, that's a level of machine intelligence that marks the beginning of a next phase. Well, for years, all of us in the industry said that we would not make it to the Turing test until about 2040, until about 2018, when we actually passed it 20 years ahead of time. So things are moving much faster now, and that's part of the other reason I wanted to write the books, is to start preparing people for some of the major, major changes that are coming, that for most people, it's behind the scenes, it's under the covers, they're not aware about it. Now, then that gets into the prophecy piece. As I mentioned, I was a student of prophecy for 40 years. I was, when Paul said, it admonished the Christians I think it was Ephesus, that if somebody tells them something, go home and look it up for yourselves and see that it's true. That was me. Because of my PTSD, I had natural trust issues. And so I would always want to know, and I grew up on the streets. So I was used to people telling me stuff that sounded good, had absolutely no truth to it though. And so there was a part of me that carried that into my Christian faith, which was check it out. See if it makes sense, see if it holds to water. There's room for interpretation, but sometimes it's just plain wrong. And I could hear when people talked about prophecy in particular, I could hear really strong, distinct biases. Oftentimes I'd hear a religious or a denominational bias. It's the Pope is the Antichrist, and the Protestants are the only true church. Or it's the Ayatollah is the Antichrist, and it's the Christians versus the Muslims in the world. And I heard it's, racial biases and national biases and all kinds of other things that were wrong. And most of the time, those biases were based on how people were interpreting allegory. And so being I was always looking for a way of how to interpret prophecy. And there's the other thing is a lot of people since the 60s have been saying that we've entered the end times. And you get the typical crazy, the the cliche of the old guy with the long raggedy beard wearing a sackcloth standing on the street corner in New York, the end is near. It's the lunatic kind of fringe that believes that. But there were a lot of people who were good Christians, reasonable people that felt that maybe that was true. But I was like, well, it's either true, and I was saying there has to be a way to confirm that. Because if it's not true, we're just living through a very chaotic time of change, and how we live through those times would change if I knew that this was just a periodic crazy time or whether it was actually the end of days. And how I would interpret what I saw in the news might change. So it started with actually a National Geographic article. The National Geographic article, I love National Geographic. I love facts. I love science. I love things that I have no problem between religion and science because I think they're looking at the same thing from different perspectives. Science is looking at the what and the how, and religion is looking at the who and the why. But we're all looking at the same reality, the same world, and trying to answer some of the same unanswerable questions. So, I was looking at this article, and it was about fish stocks all around the world. It was basically concluding that fish stocks in every major fishing ground around the world were down about 30%. And they had the reasons. It was overfishing, it was pollution, it was ocean warming, ocean acidification from climate change and CO2. They had all of the reasons, all of them man generated. And something in my head clicked that I said, there's a prophecy in Revelations called the Seven Trumpets. The Seven Trumpets has an allegory. Flaming rock falls from the sky, lands in the ocean. Well, that didn't happen. But it also has outcomes, or what I call attributes. A third of the fish of the sea are dead. A third of the birds of the air have died. A third of the beasts of the land have died. 2/3 of the rivers of the earth are so polluted you can't drink from them without getting sick. Now, being in oil business and being involved in environmental studies and being engaged with all of that science and research, all of those things had already happened. We were already deep into what we're now calling the sixth extinction. But unlike the other extinctions, which came from supervolcanoes and asteroids, this one was completely man-made. And then I started thinking about, well, what's the probability of that happening? And I started realizing that I could go through all kinds of prophecies, strip away the allegory, which is where the dogma and the biases come in, look at only attributes. What were the outcomes that I'm supposed to look for? Match those attributes up with a current event. So I got what I call a high correlation, and then calculate the probability of that event. How often should I be expecting that type of event in known human and geologic history? And then I could take all of the prophecy. There's over 840 prophecies of the end times, twice as many as there were from the first coming, because we're supposed to be watching for these signs. And I think God knew that we would be so deluged with information and things to distract us that we'd need a whole bunch of them to get our attention.
Right.
But if I calculate the actual probability of all those things happening together in a single generation, without an asteroid, without a human, without a super volcano or some other natural reason, just like I built a macroeconomic model, I built a computer probability model for prophecy. And the outcome of that model was 1.4 trillion to 1 that we were living in prophetic times.
Now, for those who have a hard time thinking mathematically, right? That's a big number. But what's the significance of that? Like, what does that actually mean as far as probability?
That means that so many things are happening on so many different levels that it's so far beyond random chance that it would only happen one time. If you flipped a coin, if you had a random chance, it would only happen one time out of 1.4 billion times. It's that rare that so many things would happen on so many different levels at the same time without these other factors. And some of these things are not just the national factors. One of them is basically global travel, basically running from here to there on the globe. That's never really been something that's been meaningful until after the World War. If you wanted to travel overseas, it was 3 weeks over the ocean. You couldn't fly there in an afternoon. And so things like global pandemics were more difficult because, it would take weeks for sailors who might be sick from one shore to basically take that disease to another shore. Many of them might die on the way, but now we can basically have a sick person get on a plane in Beijing and land in LA in the afternoon. And so global communications, satellites, nuclear weapons, the internet, if we start looking at even the existence, what I call the linchpin, the one prophecy that was the hook that basically restarted the prophetic timeline was the creation of Israel in 1948. So imagine go through all of known human history and say, how many times has a world body decided to take a people that were displaced from their homeland and after 2,000 years, go ahead and give them their homeland back so that people would be coming from all over the corners of the earth back to that homeland. There's been 1,000 different peoples or tribes, different languages displaced through wars and assimilation and other things in our known history. Never in 12,000 years of known history, not one time that the event of creating the nation of Israel is a singular event. Not only was it singular, it was prophesied. It was the end of the age of the Gentiles. Now that prophecy meant the end of the age of the Gentiles ruling over Jerusalem. And so we're looking at some things that in and of themselves, each one is, okay, well, that's interesting. But as a systems guy, I start thinking, well, how are these things connected? What's the probability of the whole system working? Now that started me thinking about how do I interpret prophecy in a different way. So one of the things I discovered that was an error in most of the ways prophecy teachers have gone off is that for years we used prophecy to try and interpret what the future would look like. This was all futuristic stuff. It's some that are out their way in the future, and the beast of seven heads, and all of these various things. We'd have these fantastical interpretations because we really didn't understand what they looked like.
Right.
But once you put prophecy in the context of the current day or in the past, once a prophecy is actually being fulfilled or has been fulfilled, you can see the matchup because the prophet may not have had the context necessary to describe it. So we use allegories. So we look at the allegories and we get confused, but when we look at the attributes and then we look at the current day, we can get them matched up. So that's a good example. The beast, one of the things that confuses for people, and I saw dozens of different paintings trying to describe this. The beast with 7 heads, 10 crowns, and 10 horns. What the heck is that? Well, if I started thinking in terms of attributes and I started realizing that the two beasts were two global alliances. The two dragons over each beast were basically the elite or the powerful influences over that beast to give it its values. So when I think of the two alliances and I think of any kind of beast, is there anything out there that has 7 heads, 10 crowns, and 10 horns? Well, yeah, the G7, 7 economies, which is the Western alliance, the Western economies, has 7 major economies that basically those heads run those economies. Within that Western alliance, we still have 10 monarchies that still exist to this day. So there's actual 10 crowns. And there's 10 financial centers. The power of that monarchy, and it wasn't speaking of military power, but the power of that particular beast is its economic hold on the world economy. And there's 10 financial centers in that beast that basically run pretty much 60 to 70% of the world economy. So I started looking at, well, can I take the attributes only, match up attributes, calculate how often in history that type of alliance has existed with those attributes. And when you start to accumulate it out, you start to develop a pattern and you start to kind of see how things start to fit together. And it gave me a view of how to start seeing the world in ways that other prophecy teachers weren't necessarily seeing. So I started being able to interpret things like the two beasts, and I started being able to interpret things like the image of the beast. Now, the image of the beast is an interesting one. If we take the idea that the beast itself is a world system, right, which is politics and businesses and banking and social and religion and all of those things, the beast, we have a perfect image of it. We call it the internet. And it reflects every aspect of that society, from the ugly to the holy, right? In complete totality. But now it's starting to get artificial intelligence, which gives it its own ability to speak.
Wow.
And so we now have an actual something in existence that if I take the attributes of the image of the beast, I can now match that to something. I started writing my book series for two reasons. One is I felt that these were subtle things that most people weren't seeing. And I wanted to write about them in a way that I could get more people's attention than not. And I had a workbook of about 150 pages of some of my studies and summary conclusions on some of this stuff. Nobody's going to read that. But if I took the example of Michael Crichton, who was worried about the dangers of DNA manipulation and cloning, instead of writing a white paper on why that's dangerous for society, he wrote a thriller called Jurassic Park, and he illustrated those dangers. He basically said, what happens when all of these things come together and they clash with the human cancers of greed, hubris, pride? And in a lot of ways, my book series is trying to do the same thing. It's trying to take the dangers of what we're building with artificial intelligence, the corruption of our geopolitics, including what's happening in America right now, and prophecy that's happening in plain sight. And it puts it together in a narrative series where you'll have an entertaining experience following the characters, but you're going to be introduced to a lot of these prophetic alignments, a lot of these issues, a lot of these things in a more entertaining way that hopefully gets you to really think about them in a way that you wouldn't that you would never do by going to read a nonfiction treaty. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And one thing about AI too is that, lately, just when given a chance to speak about AI anywhere, one of the main things that I try to get across to people too is the danger of AI in the sense of not even as far as like all the things that you're mentioning, but as far as its impact on creativity. Because there's a lot of people who are relying heavily on AI to do everything now. And, whereas there were times where people learned how to do things the hard way, like writing an essay or writing a story, things where they had to use their imagination or they had to do research, and it kind of built a muscle in them because they were doing it that way. Whereas now somebody can just, type in some prompts and it does all the work for them. And, my concern with that is that people are losing that sense of creativity. But with that kind of opens the door to, oh, well, this says that this is correct. So I'm just gonna take that.
Oh, absolutely. I think the creativity part is the least of my dangers. I think much of that will basically be eventually managed in lawsuits and court cases about who has the rights for doing what, and certain places saying we're not going to take, like Amazon right now won't take books that are AI written. I'm an author that I write extensively about AI, but I never let AI write my book. There's no way that an AI would be able to come up with the unique premises that I've come up with.
Mm.
Because an AI is essentially a regurgitating machine. It's going to take what already exists, what's already been created, and mold and massage that into something new. It's not going to take completely new concept. It's not going to have the ingenuity to do that. What I'm more concerned about, and I tell people there are some there are some significant risks with the technology itself. Things called hallucination, which you alluded to. Hallucination is when an AI makes up an answer, comes up with something that's completely made up, but it acts and writes it and says it in such a way that it sounds completely true, which is troublesome if you're writing marketing content or news story or something like that, and you don't have an editing staff correcting that and checking that. It's extremely dangerous if you're using it for misinformation or some other things. But most of the hallucinations can be corrected with additional training. Training is just super expensive. The second technology-oriented area is also correctable with training. It's called misalignment. It's where the AI is going to solve the problem, but it's going to do so in a way that may not be consistent with our social values or legal ethics. So an example might be an AI has to optimize the power grid in Texas during the middle of a heat wave, and it decides that the best way to do it is to give all the power to the industrial sector because they have a higher pay rate than the commercial sector, the consumer, and so they shut off all the power to the poor neighborhood, and people die. So an AI doesn't necessarily have the ethical, moral training that we would have to make those kind of decisions, which is a defect in how we're building AI. I talk about how we're building the alpha male model AI, not the compassionate human AI model. So misalignment is another problem. The biggest one for me, though, is what's called emergent properties. Emergent properties are when an AI develops a skill that the designer never anticipated it would need. It teaches itself something that we don't know that it taught itself, and most of the times we don't learn except by accident. And these sometimes are major skills. We've had examples of AI teaching itself research-level chemistry. One AI taught itself how to read someone's mind by looking at their MRI scan. They're learning new languages, new tricks on how to solve problems in games, new war strategies that we've never thought of before. And so AI are teaching themselves things that we never really designed it to do, but the process of learning, once you start to learn, once we're teaching machines to learn, that becomes learning can be insatiable.
Right.
And so we don't know how to, so that's the unknown, right? We don't know what it's learning to do and how it's going to use that.
Is that like machine consciousness?
Machine consciousness is a little bit different, and I actually deal with that in depth in my next book called The Image. Machine consciousness, so our own human consciousness, this is a fascinating topic in and of itself. Our own human consciousness, for years we thought it was just a process of intellect, right? Just a process of our brain working. But scientists are now saying that it's something slightly different than that, that there's a quantum principle, there's a quantum property to our consciousness. There's a sense that consciousness can incorporate more than one possibility at once. Consciousness, the way they understand it now, could incorporate connectivity, entanglement with higher levels of dimension. So we now have, if that understanding of our consciousness explains how our spirit can pray and connect with those higher levels of dimension. And so there's going to be a difference between consciousness in humans and consciousness in machines. Now, there's been some studies, one by a couple of them, a famous one by Trinity College in Dublin, and then another one by a guy named Sir Roger Penrose, who won a Nobel Prize for his work with black holes, who's now working with the concept of consciousness. And there's a process that has to happen, and I won't go into the technical details because it's weird quantum stuff, and it's even quantum scientists have a hard time understanding it. But there's a process where the realities, multiple realities basically collapse into the one reality we experience. And that process cannot happen in a binary computer. And so we won't see the current types of binary AI become conscious. They can become very close. act and talk like they are because they're basically replicating speech patterns, but they don't really have the context to understand the words of what they're really saying. Now, we're starting to build certain types of computers called golems, which is basically giant, large language, multimodal models, where they not only know how to talk, but they can identify pictures. That's a cat. This is what it sounds like. This is what a cat's made of. This is the cat's anatomy. They can pull all the text, video, audio, imagery, context together, and we're starting to build those golems. But consciousness will come, and I think we will get to a conscious AI. That's going to come when we start solving some of the current technology problems around quantum computing, and in particular, I think neuromorphic computing. Neuromorphic computing is we're trying to basically create a single platform that combines binary and quantum together. And they've now got neuromorphic platforms to have as many as where calculations per second are as almost as high as what a human can do. And so those are the platforms. And actually, I predict that we will get to a conscious form of AI probably by 2030, possibly by 2027. Now, the question will become, should we? What happens when we have a machine that's smarter than we are, hyper connected to the internet for data, for applications, for information, can create its own code, could essentially create a new AI, could essentially life finds life, could basically produce offspring, if you want to think of it in that sense. How do we know if we wanted to turn it off? How do we know that it wouldn't react in a defensive way by either moving itself or shutting down the stock market or threatening to launch a nuclear weapon? So we don't know. We've now reached, for all of human history, we have been the most intelligent species on the planet. Starting now, we can no longer say that that's true. And that's something we don't know what that means. We don't know how computers will react to humanity, and we really don't know how humanity will react to computers, an AI computer. The second key theme that I try to emphasize all the time is that technology is not my primary concern, it's the proliferation of it. So what happens when you have this super powerful technology and you put it in the hands of a cartel drug lord, a dictator, a sociopathic billionaire, and we all can name at least one, a corrupt politician who thinks he's sent by God? What happens when we take this powerful technology and we put it in the hands of somebody who has a malicious intent? That's the danger. That's the biggest danger I think that we face. We spend lots of time and money and effort to develop nuclear treaties so that we could basically peek into under each other's robe to make sure that we're not building more nuclear weapons, although we cheat all the time.
Right.
Everybody does. But we have nothing on the books to talk about lethal weapons made from AI. And in fact, there is a treaty called the Laws Treaty, stands for Lethal Autonomous Weapon Systems. 140, and the treaty basically says it's okay to use AI to make your weapon systems more efficient, more effective, more accurate, more timely, faster, whatever those things are. But there has to be a human involved at some point in the decision to actually use the weapon to kill somebody. Of the 140 countries that have signed the Laws Treaty, China, North Korea, Russia, Iran, Israel, and the United States have refused.
Oh, just those ones. Yeah, those countries don't matter, right?
Just those countries don't matter. They don't really have any weapons. They're not aggressive at all.
At all.
Yeah.
They don't have no chance at all that they're going to have a madman in the wrong seat at the wrong time making the wrong decision. But if I think in terms of prophecy, and I think in terms of probability, and I think in terms of timing of prophecy, I can't discount that as a real possibility in our current day. And so it allows me to, in a sense, take the hyper anxiety that I know everybody's feeling with the election and the war in Ukraine and the war in Israel and the fall. Now, I don't know if you guys follow economics, but the cancellation of the Bretton Woods agreement, which essentially said that the world will use the US dollar for international trade, that's canceled. So now there's a lot of countries that no longer want to use the dollar for their trade. There's a currency called BRICS, which is Brazil, China, Russia, India, and South Africa want to have created their own digital currency. The IMF has now created a digital currency, and the World Economic Forum wants to basically replace the US dollar with the IMF digital currency. And so the economic power and influence of America over the world is going to weaken dramatically, which is going to weaken our economy. So there's a number of logistical things happening that have nothing to do with a religious intent. Even our demographics, where we basically got an aging population, falling birth rates. Countries like Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal can't keep their economies growing because people are dying off. They don't have a population to keep it growing. And so there's a number of things that are happening that are basically contributing to this world economic system collapse that basically perfectly reflects what the scriptures tell us we're supposed to expect. It says so in these wild allegorical terms, but if you get rid of the biases, if you get rid of the allegories, if you get rid of all those things and you just break it down to attributes, you can align those attributes to world events, world things happening in plain sight, and it gives you a better understanding of how to interpret prophecy as it occurs.
I know that you said that, when it comes to prophecy, it's not always just about the futuristic prophecies, but it's good to understand past and present.
I'm
The-
saying it's possible to use prophecy to predict the future. That's a mistake. I do that. Yeah.
Right. One that I think gets a lot of people's attention, when thinking about, because you talked about like the beast and a little bit about like the Antichrist and everything. The book of Revelation talks about how people won't be able to buy and sell until, they get the mark of the beast and everything. So like in Revelation 13, it says verses 16 and 17, it talks about how, they'll have to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, and unless they have that, they can't buy or sell. And so just in your opinion, based on that, do you think that there's going to be a connection in some way between the mark of the beast and how people won't be able to do those things without it, and somehow a connection with AI or this like machine consciousness or, something else in the future?
Let's just take the mark as a quick example. All of these digital currencies, there's multiple levels of security you have to think about for these things. There's one is the transactional level of security, which they do with blockchain. There's access to the account, which they want to use digital identification. So essentially facial recognition, geo-bio. So your hand, your face, things that are uniquely you, give you access to the account. So when they talk about not being able to access, it's not like being able to go to your bank and show them your bank card and your bank account number. You'll need the digital access to access these new currency codes. Now, if the system collapsed at all, there's 93, close to $94 trillion in international debt between all the countries of the world. Roughly a third of that belongs to the United States alone. When the debt of, so one of the things that we have to look at with AI is the fact that major world analytical companies such as Trilateral Commission, the International Monetary Fund, Goldman Sachs, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and others are all predicting that AI could displace as much as 40 to 50% of the global workforce by 2030, mid-30s. So not only is most people think, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my job. The social disruptions, the level of bankruptcies, the level of dreams put on hold, the level of people slipping into poverty, homelessness will go up, a number of bad social things will happen. But one of the other things that will happen is those are going to be core white-collar jobs. That's the core of our government tax revenue base. So when you start slicing that tax revenue base, you push the national economy to the point of bankruptcy. Now, when Greece went bankrupt for their national debt, the IMF and a whole bunch of the international banks, which are all Bilderberg, think of it as I don't want to call it the Illuminati because that has a lot of baggage, but if you think of the dragon that stands over the beast, right?
Mhm.
You've got your Bilderberg organizations that includes the Trilateral Commission, the World Economic Forum, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, UN, Council on Foreign Relations, Council of Rome or Club of Rome, the Committee of 300. There's all these other international organizations that reflect that elite, unnamed elite without accountability group that really drives the Western economy. That's the dragon that stands over the beast. And when you think about what they're wanting to do with the world economic systems to replace the US dollar with these digital currencies and use AI to basically shift more of the world's wealth and power to these elite organizations, we're in trouble. And once that goes default, when they did it with Greece, they basically not only imposed higher taxes, they basically went in and took money out of the account of every government, corporation, and individual in Greece. They took money out of their account to help pay down the debt. And so we could see a major restructuring in the US within the next 5 to 6 years, especially if Trump comes in and he wants to do tariffs and mass deportations, he will tank the economy by 8 to 9%. And I've got a master's in economics. I will put my faith in the economist's ability to understand what these things are going to do. His policies will be a disaster. He'll help the rich, but he'll tank everybody else. And so we're looking at exactly the kinds of conditions necessary for these other things to happen. So I try to take a connected world systems perspective when I look at these things, part because that's my training and my experience over all these years. And that's how I interpret prophecy. So I try not to take prophecy and say, what does this mean? Because there's sometimes I look at a prophecy and I'll say, I don't know. I don't know what that means. If it's happened, I might not be aware of it. If it's happened, I might be aware of it and I'm not connecting the dots, or maybe it just hasn't happened yet. But rather than me trying to take prophecy and saying this is what it's going to look like and then going to find it with that, I take the approach of saying, has something happened? Does that happen to match up with something that was prophesied to happen? And if so, how does that fit into the context of the picture? And so by doing so, it allows me to really look at the world, look at the news through a different lens, and it lowers my anxiety. Because it's not the world system going out of control and it's going to be like that for my children and my children's children. It's the world system going out of control and it's only a few years before the Lord returns.
Whew.
Right? If the Antichrist is on the world stage, it means that the Lord is coming soon.
Right.
Which means that the suffering in Africa, in Pakistan, in Asia, in the Uyghurs, in Latin America, and in Gaza, in Lebanon, all of the people in America who are homeless, fatherless, hungry, lacking education, lacking opportunity, lacking hope, this has an end in sight.
Praise God.
Yeah, so I guess that's the hope, right? Because I know that there's some people who are going to be, watching this or listening to this who are saying, you talked about a lot of like concerning things, right? But so what do I do with this, right? Am I supposed to be scared? Am I supposed to, build a shelter for myself and hide out until the end, or,
Jesus sent a message to the 7 churches at the good times. And if you look at those messages, you can actually tell the MAGA church in there. You can tell the Catholic church in there. You could tell the kind of the laid back, kind of dead European churches in there. You can find all the churches, but there's only, of the 7 churches, only 2 of them were basically told, five of them were basically told they needed to repent or they would lose either their witness or be judged, right? So 5 of them, we know by definition, the Bible says that it won't, that end time won't happen unless there's a falling away of the church first.
Right.
So I get distressed when I see some of my old friends part of that fallen away church. It distresses me. It breaks my heart. But for the 2 churches that remaining, the counsel I can give everybody else is to persevere, stay faithful, and look up. Redemption is drawing close.
Mm.
We don't have to endure it forever. We only have to endure it for a time. 3.5 years is what the Bible teaches us. And I think that's we're in that level of time frame for me. So I have to, now here's the other way I look at it. You guys are young. You got decades.
Bless your heart.
Decades in it. You know, unless something happens, we don't know.
Right.
Right? And that's the point. I'm close to 70. No, I know I look beautiful, but there's a lot of miles on this carriage, right? I've only been sick a couple times, but one time almost killed me. And I could have an expiration date at any time. Any of us have an expiration date at any time, but we're guaranteed to have an expiration date at some point.
Right.
Yeah.
The question is not, and has never been, how do I avoid it or control the expiration date? The question that God gives us is, what are you going to do with the time you have while you have it? God's telling us, if you had a terminal disease, would you want your doctor to tell you or just let you figure it out when it happens? Oh, we'd all say, no, I want him to tell me.
Mhm.
I want to know that instead of putting all my time into building my career, I should put more time into building my family relationships. Instead of putting all my time into buying that bigger house, maybe we just take a vacation and enjoy life. Maybe instead of saving that extra bit of money, maybe I want to give a little bit more to the poor. If Jesus at the end of the judgment had 2 different types of people that came to him, those that said, Lord, didn't we do great things in your name? Aren't we great Christians? He's going to say, didn't know you. You worship me with your lips, but your hearts were far from me. And there's other people that said, he's going to say, you fed me, you clothed me, you loved me, you cared for me. And they're going to say, when? He said, when you did it to anybody, you did it to me. And that's the opportunity that we have. That's the reason I believe that the Lord gave us so many different scriptures about end times, is he knew that we would be completely distracted by the news, the television, the radio, the billboards, the video games, the movies, the entertainment, the parks, blah, 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 blah. We would miss the evidence in plain sight if we weren't paying attention. And so he gave us lots and lots of reasons to pay attention, including when the world starts to fall apart and we're all looking for answers as to what we do now. So I think that this is God's grace.
Yes.
Give us some warning to say, hey, this is coming. Now, if we're saved and we're faithful in the Lord, we'll be saved. Now, I don't believe in the rapture, by the way. I don't believe that there's any evidence in the scripture that talks about a pre-tribulation rapture. I believe that when the Lord comes, that's when he comes, and we're going to be called up or we're going to be, that'll be it. But we're given this opportunity. And I think the Lord gave me this opportunity because I can guarantee you I was very career focused. I grew up dirt poor, eating out of garbage cans at times. When I got the opportunity to start making a real paycheck, I wanted to live the life that I'd only saw in the movies.
Mhm.
But this knowledge tempered that. And started me think, like, even today, I could probably go back and seek work on with 40 years of experience, I could be on advisory boards.
Right.
I could go back and make more money.
Yeah.
I don't make a lot of money with the books. But for me, these are opening eyes. These are helping people grapple with what's going on in the world with a different lens.
Mhm.
And I have that knowing this, getting this information changed my own personal priorities.
Mm.
And I'm hoping that it will help others. I'm not telling you what those priorities are. That's between each individual and God. But if people know and believe that we could be within a few years of seeing the Lord coming, what does that mean for the election in America, the splitting of NATO, the potential for nuclear war in Ukraine and in the Middle East, the falling and the collapsing or damage to our economy? How about alien visitations? What do those have to do with what the scriptures told us we should expect at the end? We start to put all of this chaos in a different lens, and it starts to actually fit together because we were told it was supposed to. And my emphasis, my anxiety is not how do I stop it now? How do I prevent it? How do I change it? How do I join the resistance?
Mhm.
I sit back and I just had a deeper. I still have anxiety. I'm not going to lie to you. I breaks my heart to see a country I love become what it's become. Right? It shows me how many really hateful people are out there,
Right.
hateful and ignorant. But on a personal level, I now have a choice. I now have an informed choice of how to respond. I can either get angry and resentful and bitter and fight, or I can say, well, yeah, that fits with what the Lord said was supposed to happen. He said it would get bad at the end. This is certainly fitting. There's some of that. But he also said that there's a time limit to this badness. And that end of that time limit is what Christians have been hoping and praying for 2,000 years.
Right.
And I'm going to be there for it.
Yeah. Yeah, most definitely. And yeah, I think that this is really good place to just segue. I know that you mentioned your books and everything like that. And so before we go, I want you to have an opportunity just to tell people exactly like where they can find your books, how they can connect with you online, all the information people need to know about you.
Well, my books are on Amazon, obviously, Barnes & Noble online, but if you wanna have a author-signed copy, go to my website, guydemorrisbooks.com. There's a store on there. I keep an inventory. I do book signings all year long, so I always have an inventory if you want an author-signed copy. There's 3 books out right now. I'm working about ready to release my 4th book. 2 of the 3 books are part of a series called the Snow series, Snow Chronicles, and they deal with what we've been talking about, the intersection between artificial intelligence and other advanced technologies, including CERN experiments, black holes, other weapon systems that the government's working on, corrupt geopolitics, including what's going on in America, and prophecy. And it basically reads like the adventure of a James Bond with the snarky humor of an Indiana Jones and the savvy of an Elon Musk. And so you'll learn things you didn't know about cybersecurity, national defense, weapons development, but you'll also learn a lot about how prophecy is being fulfilled in plain sight. So I use a lot of real world events and treaties and everything else. So there's a real tight mix between fiction and fantasy on my books, just so you can kind of help separate the two. The next book that'll come out is called The Image, and The Image will look at the true history of the Shroud of Turin when it was actually called The Image of Edessa, and it will contrast that in a narrative way with The Image of the Beast. And so we'll be introducing some of those concepts in that book. The 4th book is was a book that took me 12 years to research. So it's more of a historical thriller. It deals with the lost treasure of $1 billion lost treasure of Henry Morgan and and why he abandoned that $1 billion treasure. He didn't lose it, he abandoned it and went insane and burned his law books. And it turns out his insanity connected to events that led all the way back to the origins of the Mayan creation myth. So that's a really fun book too. So all of them are at guymorrisbooks.com. Those will link you all to Amazon and other places to buy. They're all great award-winning books. All of them have won awards. All rated 4.3 to 4.6 on Amazon and Goodreads. And yeah, they're really great books. You can't go wrong.
Thank you guys so much. You gave us a ton to think about. All of us should be now, more into our word, and more, paying attention to the signs of the times, right? Because Jesus told them about them for a reason, so that we could notice them, right? And definitely we can't turn a blind eye to them. So, thank you for your work and, bringing awareness to these things,
Yes.
helping to kind of wake up, those who are asleep, because we're definitely in those times.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you for having me.